So how important is the relationship between he and Nancy in this movie? We'll talk about how it's told through the voice of a former KGB agent in a minute, but let's talk about the relationship between he and Nancy in this movie.
I think outside of his personal relationship with Jesus, that Nancy was the most important relationship in his life, along with his mother as well. But Nancy really got to know him probably better than anybody. And I think that there would not have been a President Ronald Reagan without Nancy. And that's not to say that, she pulled the strings or whatever, but it's a testimony to what really great, solid relationship can do and how it can work in your life to the benefit, uplifting to both. And they had an amazing marriage and an incredible love story. He wrote her a love note like every day.
Yeah.
I'm talking about for 50 years.
Yeah.
And they still had that thing that everybody thinks you should have in your relationship.
I didn't have the privilege of knowing him, but I did have the privilege of knowing Nancy in the later years. I'm proud to say she was a big fan of the Dr. Phil show. She watched it religiously and knew every detail about shows. We would go to dinner at Larry King's house, and he always said she held him hostage. She would come to dinner, but only if Robin and I would come. If we couldn't come, she would not come. And so he was always saying, you guys have to come. And she would argue with me about Dr. Phil shows. And I would have just done a show that had aired, and I'd have a book 250 pages thick about the guests, know every detail. She would dispute some detail that I had in writing, and I'd push back a little bit, and then pretty soon I realized, you're not going to win this.
Yeah.
So I just say, yes, Nancy, you're right.
Yeah, don't argue with the boss, right?
No. She'd give her opinion about what I should have said instead of what I said.
Right. Well, I do that for myself every day.
Yeah.
What I should have said. Their love story is really at the center of this film.
Well, she told me that even in the later years when, he was suffering from the cognitive decline, she said the core of his personality still would shine through, even when he didn't know her, that he was still the consummate gentleman. That he would still just ask after her, ma'am, get you a chair, would you have a seat, please?
That's who he was.
That's absolutely who he genuinely was to the core of his soul. There was nothing. He wasn't trying to be polite. He wasn't trying to put on anything. It's just who he was, even though he didn't know who she was.
That's what shone through, I think, to everyone. I mean, that's why, he had Reagan Democrats, and he was, because you could feel who he was, I think, at the core. Certainly there were those, who or still to this day, don't want to be a part. Don't want to be a part of the Reagan story. Don't want to, still the same issues keep coming. He was a warmonger. He was this. And this is not like a love letter to Reagan either. There's a few things that, I vehemently disagreed with him on at the time. For one thing, the way he handled AIDS, which I think could have been, in retrospect, done better.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the negotiations with Gorbachev, which, he proved me wrong about that, in Iceland, when he walked out of that meeting, and I thought, oh my gosh, he's acting like an old codger. But then that was the impetus of what got the Soviets to cave. He always wanted, this is the other thing that's at the core of the film, is the fight of the Cold War and the fighting against communism. He was the very first leader that we had that really said no to the Soviets.
Yeah.
Up until then, it had been appeasement in one form or another, or just let's go along and get along. And Reagan came along and said, this story is we win, they lose. And that's what happened. And I think it took like a Cold Warrior to win the Cold War.
Yeah.
And things would have been living in a different world, I truly believe, if it hadn't been for him.
Now, this is told through the voice of a former KGB agent.
Mm-hmm.
Why were they so focused on Reagan 5 years before he ever really came on the scene? How did they identify him? Why were they so dialed into him?
I think they really identified him going way back into the 40s and 50s when he became, he was vice president of the Screen Actors Guild.
Yeah.
And then became president as well. And lo and behold, it wasn't just a conspiracy theory like many purported, but the Soviet Union was infiltrating our unions and the entertainment industry to take over. By taking over the unions, you control a lot of things, and they were sending people into union meetings and things like using those same sort of Marxist things,
Mm-hmm.
Putting people in a diamond shape at the corners and causing a ruckus and to disruption. And Reagan fought him every step of the way. I mean, even physically. And he hated communism. He hated what it did to nations and peoples and the lie of the communist system.
So their focus on him early was his resistance to them infiltrating Hollywood.
Yeah.
They had no idea that he was going to, or do you think they did, that he had bigger things in his future?
Well, they kept a list on everybody, as well as our government kept records on everybody. And there were a lot of the McCarthy hearings, which I myself kind of look upon as kind of a disgrace, or how far it can go the other way. Like, as far as the red baiting and that went on. Reagan actually went and testified himself, before the committee. I think that's in the trailer. In fact, that ruined quite a number of lives. But there was actual activity going on. And in the end, I think it went too far with McCarthyism. To that famous quote, "At long last, you have no shame."
Yeah.
I think it was Kefauver or somebody asked McCarthy. But they kept tabs on him because he was politically active. And, as governor of California, they were interested in that too. I mean, and then when he became president, here was a guy that was going to be tough to deal with. Like I said, America had practiced appeasement and agreements. We had détente, we had SALT, we had, we'd gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Jimmy Carter, who I voted for, by the way, the first time that he was up, he was a really good man, and I thought he did an incredible job with the Middle East, with Egypt and Israel, but it seemed to be appeasement with the Russians. He gave away the B-1 bomber. He gave away quite a number of things without getting anything in return. And I think that the Soviets lost respect with that and felt they could run all over him, and built their military up. And there was a lot going on in Africa back, these proxy wars in the Central America as well. And Reagan came along, and man, oh man, they didn't know what hit him. He was the first one to say no.